In Lesson 10, Dobson titles it about pronouns and teaches you about plural pronouns, but also includes a couple of other little bits and pieces, most notably a discussion about accents. A lot of this is more for information and for thinking about than it is for learning, so you may find that although this is relatively long, there is actually very little that you need to think about learning. The first topic are the first and second person plural pronouns. You don't need to worry about the third person because you already learned that. Autos. He, she or it simply becomes pluralised to autoi. So third person ones don't feature in this because you've sort of learnt as much as you need to think about with those. What you need now is a slightly separate set of the first and second person. These share a characteristic mu as their main letter of note that will let you know this is the kind of thing you're dealing with. All the first person ones then have an eta before that. The second person ones have an upsilon before it. You then have the endings. Hemes, hemas, hemon, hemin, humes, humas, humon, humin. This is one of the places where I'm deliberately using a more classical pronunciation because it really matters with these. You'll notice that there is a breathing over the eta and over the upsilon. In a modern Greek pronunciation, that would have disappeared, and both eta and upsilon are now pronounced as an I. So modern Greek, both are pronounced imis. And this process was already happening in the New Testament. So you cannot phonetically, if you're listening, tell the difference between we and you plural. And the very occasionally in the New Testament, that helps understand why there are textual problems with this. That if you're listening to this as a text, you cannot differentiate between we and you. On the page, however, you can. The eta for the first person, the upsilon for the second person. If you need a way to remember this, perhaps remember that there's a u in you. And that might help you differentiate between we and you plural, which is how you would translate these. And if you think about that a bit further, you've therefore got us and again you. So thinking about the accusative of those, remember what your English looks like. The second point in this textbook is the relative pronoun. And I want to think about this in three ways. First of all, actually, just what are we doing with relatives in English? Take a sentence like, I read a book. The book is interesting. You have two sentences with a full stop in the middle and a shared noun. We could get rid of one of those nouns by putting the word which into the sentence and now simply having a comma. And this is now a relative clause, which in English is introduced with a pronoun such as which and follows a punctuation mark such as a comma because relative clauses cannot be standalone independent clauses by themselves. They are not complete sentences, so they are going to be embedded into other sentences. In Greek, the relative pronoun is used hugely, and you will find that it starts new sentences because it points so beautifully to the noun that was before. What which does is it points back to the book. And you'll hear the words anaphoric and cataphoric being used, pronouns. And that tells you, is the pronoun pointing to a word that you've already had or a word that you're about to have. Cataphoric points back, anaphoric points forward. So your relative pronoun is going to be cataphoric or anaphoric, and it's going to point either back to a noun you've already had or forwards to a noun that you're about to have. And in Greek, because it declines, that means that you can link to your nouns very carefully. If you think about this clausally, which is interesting, describes the book, which is exactly the same as just making an adjective and putting it in the adjective place. So you may find that you want to translate things like adjectives as relative clauses, or indeed can sometimes make relative clauses into adjectives. And this shows in participles, where often the best way to translate a participle, the book is sitting on the desk, You may want to say the book which is sitting on the desk and make it into a relative clause, because participle ones can get quite long-winded. They're describing things. The most straightforward way to do a long-winded description in English is to use a relative clause. So these are about different ways of describing things. So we have them in English. We use the relative pronoun which. It's describing the noun. So in English, you might occasionally want to translate it just as an adjective. That's your basic idea of how relative pronouns work. They combine sentences and link things together. The pronoun itself in Greek is really straightforward. Hos, he, ho, hon, hen, ho, who, hes, who, ho, he, ho. Followed by hoi, hi, ha, hus, has, ha, hone, 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 hois, heis, hois. If you want this in the book, see page 68. The whole thing is given to you in chapter 12. What it essentially is your noun endings without a noun attached to it, or in most cases the definite article without the T. So these are endings that you've already met, and they're kind of endings without a starting. The ending by itself functions as a relative pronoun, making the relative pronoun very easy to learn, but occasionally a bit frustrating to recognise, because you've got to be tuned in to breathings and accents. I've put the accent in throughout this because ho could mean the without an accent, but with an accent it means what. If we translate this, you have what or which or who. The same with hair. Hair could mean the if it didn't have an accent, but it means who or what when it has got an accent. Same with hoi or hi. So there's a pattern that you'll recognise, but they do now have accents and rough breathings. Which brings us on to the topic of accents. What are they? The Greek accent is a pitch accent. This means that your voice goes up with an acute, down with a grave, and up and down with a circumflex. This makes life a little complicated because only Norwegian in European languages has a pitch accent. And it means that Westerners are very bad about trying to conceive what it actually might mean. And in modern Greek, this is now a stress accent because it's lost that pitch element. So we tend to treat it as a stress accent, but it is a pitch accent. And therefore it gives you a sense of the intonation of Greek and how the language worked on the ear. This means that you can think of it giving a lilt. The text on the screen is from Dobson. It's the first example under 10.8 on page 53. And you can see the key issues to do with accents going on here. Verbs like lege, eche, akue, apangalusin. Verb is what we call recessive. That means that the accent will go as far back as it can on that word. And the rules are acute can go 3 syllables back. You count from the end of the word. And circumflex can go 2 syllables back. It depends on how long all the syllables are, but that's your maximum count. So lege, it's a verb, it's recessive. There's an acute on the penultimate syllable because it can't go any further back. But apangalusin, it's on the third syllable back because it can go further. You'll notice akue does have 3 syllables, but a is a long vowel, and when you've got a long vowel, it can only go 2 syllables back. So verbs are recessive, and acute accents will therefore be on the furthest away from the end syllable that they can be in that situation. You'll notice on kai and hos and tus that the accent has become a grave. If you have an acute on the last syllable of a word and there is anything else following it, that acute becomes grave. So an acute becomes grave before other words. That means kai is always going to have a grave because kai, meaning and, is always going to be followed by something. If you look it up in the dictionary, though, you will see it with an acute. Circumflex accents. I've shown you 2 different ways of writing them. You can write them as a hat or as a squiggle. I tend to do it as the hat because it's easier for the breathings underneath in the text, but either is perfectly permissible. Those are a couple of the basic rules. If you're interested in the rules more generally, they are moderately complex, but not impossible to learn. What is important is the kinds of places where they make a difference. Dobson gives you a short roundup on page 52, and I want to extend that slightly. First of all, tis with an accent is an interrogative. Who? ? Tis without an accent means a. Crino with an acute, I judge. Crino with a circumflex, I will judge. There's a certain category of verbs whose future involves a contraction of a vowel, and contractions are often shown by circumflexes. So if you see circumflexes on a final syllable, then quite often you've got a contraction in there. And that contraction can then help you work out what's going on with this word grammatically. Hair, as you've already seen, without the accent means the, and with the accent means who or what. So you've got pronouns, you've got verbs, you've got all different kinds of words that can carry an accent, and the accent will change the meaning of something. Learn the words on page 52. Other places where it's important are few and far between, and you'll get a feel for those as you read more of the New Testament. If you're really interested, there are 2 books I'd recommend. The first is Philemon Probert's. Philemon is in Oxford, so if you ever need to talk to anyone, she's also absolutely amazing. And her book is classical, so it will give you an overview of all the rules of accentuation. There's John Lees. You might have come across his name in New Testament studies. He's a biblical studies person who's recently written things like a book on the Pentateuch, and he's written a book just on biblical accents. You'll see his book isn't called New Testament because he does include the Septuagint in his work. Philemon's book is more comprehensive than John Lee's, so if you want a real understanding of Greek accents, go to hers, because it will give you a much bigger overview and not just think about the New Testament. There is one more book. D.A. Carson has written a book, a manual for students using accents. This is not available easily in the university, so I haven't included it here, but both John Lee's and Philemon's should be easily available if you're interested in following this up. If you'd like a couple of simple handouts introducing things, let me know, and I can give you some summary handouts, including ones that Philemon has produced, because it is a complex area, but it does help you disambiguate between some things, and it can help enrich your understanding of the New Testament. They are a Byzantine convention. So if you look at the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, they use them even though they say they're trying to write as though they were writing in an older form of Greek, because they're a convention that helps us understand the text better. They're what we expect to see, but they are not authentic in terms of something that was being written very early on in Greek. So they are something that helps us understand the pitch flow of ancient Greek. And sometimes that has an impact on meaning, and sometimes that impact on meaning will have an impact on exegesis. So it is worth having an understanding about how accents work, but they are a convention, and they are moderately complex to get to grips with reliably, and therefore in short courses we don't tend to have time to teach them thoroughly. But if you're interested, as I say, let me know and I can help you get up to speed on them.